What's up, guys? With this week's beta build, we finally get a look at the last few nodes of the Shadow Tree for Dragonflight, as well as a few changes to some of the talents we talked about last time. And I wanted to make a shorter video going over those, what I think they mean for the spec, and some of the current issues I see with Shadow now that we have a more complete picture. Let's start by looking at the three talents that round out the tree: Shadow Orbs, Puppet Master, and Harness Shadows. For the most part, they arrived about how we expected them, with Shadow Orbs taking a very close form to its Kata counterpart, and both the other talents giving us additional ways to stack the Shadow Orbs buff. Looking at Shadow Orbs first, we have a new passively gained damage buff, Coalescing Shadows, that buffs both Mind Blast and Mind Spike. When this buff is spent using either ability, it also gives us another high uptime maintenance buff for our periodic damage. From testing on beta, this buff feels pretty low impact to the rotation itself, as it's gained often enough to always have the periodic damage up. When you put together this new Shadow Orbs with Mind Spike and Mind Blast, however, it seems to create a weird dynamic between the three, namely in the fact that Mind Spike also consumes the buff. When first looking at Mind Spike, it felt like the identity was an instant damage proc that just buffed Mind Blasts. But with Shadow Orbs, it also actively takes away another buff designed to buff Blast. While I agree with the amounts of Coalescing Shadows it currently creates, having something other than Blast to spin Shadow Orbs on feels good. It just seems like this buff will very rarely land on a Blast due to how prevalent such of darkness procs also occur. There is one other situation I can see that does allow for Blasts to use these buffs, but it involves fishing for them with flays between spikes and casting Blasts, and creates a very rigid rotation of Mind Blast into Mind Spike, Mind Flay, into another Mind Blast with procs with Shadow Orb. Next up, we have Harness Shadow and Puppet Master. And while Harness Shadow is really just an increase to the procs already generated by Shadow Orbs, Puppet Master is a lot more interesting by generating the buff every time your Shadow Fiend melees a target, and a chance every time a Shadowy Apparition damages a target. This basically means that during your CD windows, you get a huge chunk of damage onto just about every single Blast and Spike cast. And this on top of Dark Ascension, Void Form, and Shadowflame Prism gives us a potential for a very CD-focused busty profile. Along with Shadow Orbs, we see some changes to the Shadow or Death interactions in the tree, with the removal of Painbreaker's Psalm, the addition of a new talent DeathSpeaker, and Pain of Death being moved to a new 2-point node position. With Painbreakers always being less enjoyed due to the fact that it sacrifices dot uptime, it's no surprise to see it replaced, and the Pain of Death changes really don't have too much impact other than just being a pure buff to death, and it does possibly make Dark Void Shadow Pain interaction a little bit better, as this ability is doing more damage as it's cleaving into the Shadow Pain targets. DeathSpeaker, however, is a very interesting new addition to the spec. This talent gives Pain a chance to both reset the CD of Shadow or Death and activates its execution damage under any condition. This adds a large amount of power back into Death and brings it to a similar niche as Mind Spike in the rotation, as this mainstay rotational ability that you send anytime you get a proc of DeathSpeaker. We also see an added benefit of this being another indirect buff to Shadowflame Prism with more Death casts on average. The one worry I do have with this talent is that Death currently does a large chunk of damage both to the enemy target and to the caster of the spell, making type evasion feel even more necessary to the spec. Speaking of type, we see some movement of talents in the top section of our tree, one that seems to create as many problems as it solves to me. Dispersion and Shadowy Apparitions, as well as their follow-up nodes, have been swapped. In fact, I feel like this, instead of making it better to take these utility options, it makes it worse, as now there is no way to get to the third major utility node in this section without giving up more throughput nodes, making hallucination even more inaccessible, and type evasion feel like a necessary sacrifice due to the increase in death value we just looked at. We also see some movement in the bottom of our tree with the idols of N'Zoth and Yogg-Saron being swapped. This makes these idols' positions feel a little bit better than before, with some nodes that see benefit to the capstone leading into each, but overall the bottom of our tree still feels a bit lackluster, especially with this wall of unimpactful 2 nodes still standing as strong as ever. The last set of changes I want to look at for this build are 2 of our longer CD abilities, MindGames and Dark Ascension. First, we have MindGames no longer giving Insanity, which to me is a welcome change, honestly. With MindGames being in the class tree as throughput, I would much rather MindGames be a smaller gain in damage to take, allowing for more of the defensive, utility, and all-filling options to shine without giving up that substantial chunk of damage that would be coming from MindGames. With MindGames losing Insanity, we see that Dark Ascension gains some, granting a decent bit of the resource on cast. While gaining resource on a cast is never a bad thing, this feels a little weird of a change to me due to the condition to also reset our Dark Evangelism stacks. It was already kinda hard to see what Dark Ascension's identity was with the debates on if Mind Spike would be strong enough to see dots moved out of portions of our rotation, And this new change to DA now also feeds into a resource that can only be consumed by the periodic effects, which is effectively weakened until Evangelism is restacked after casting Dark Ascension. Now that we're able to see the entire tree and have talked about the changes from this build, let's talk about some of the overall things I still see going for the spec. The first thing that I want to look at is an issue that we've seen all throughout the Shadowlands, and has yet to really be addressed. We generate a lot of insanity, which leads to a very high uptime on Devouring Plague. While being able to consistently cast a finisher sounds like a good thing, the issue that the current uptime causes is that it makes Devouring Plague feel much less like an important resource spender, and much more like another maintenance buff. This also leads directly to a need to keep it relatively low budget as a spell, contributing to the current life feeling that a Mind Blast cast is worth more than the wasted insanity generation sitting at 100 insanity. And personally, I would much rather see Devouring Plague as a much harder hitting ability with less casts, especially with how many new abilities and interactions seem to be coming into the kit. Talking about DP uptime, another closely related issue I have is with our current mastery, and there's two different issues I want to talk about here between single target and AoE. First off is the single target issue. While the mastery component on Devouring Plague has the potential of showing skill expression through setting up higher damage window bursts, especially if Plague's uptime is kept a little bit better in check, both the Vampiric Touch and Shadowwood Pain aspects feel a little bit lackluster, basically just amounting to a better verse due to the expected uptime of these dots already. There's also an issue where our mastery feels very overloaded and strong, currently contributing close to 40% of our damage on dotted targets on live. And looking at AoE now, our mastery requirement on these dots makes it feel especially bad to damage a non-dotted target, which could just feel like a decent trade-off in weakness for the stat, but due to the Void Form's mastery application, there's still a huge benefit from mastery in AoE, even if it's not affecting all of the targets, or not always affecting all the targets. But it comes with the sacrifice of our damage between CDs feeling much weaker. Overall, while I like the interaction with Devouring Plague, I would much rather see this damage not be tied to Vampiric Touch or Shadowwood Pain. The last thing I really want to talk about with this new direction for Shadow is the sheer amount of procs we see on this tree. One of the things I loved about the spec when I first started playing it in Legion was that the damage output of the spec felt very closely tied to the player's skill, without many other variables really playing a major part. And the pacing of the spec without these procs still created a very interesting gameplay. While there could be some boss mechanics that just stopped void form cycles, there was never a moment where I looked and thought, well, that man just had a 50% higher uptime of Tormented Minds and CDs. GG, I guess. The current proc economy I see in the class, especially with almost all of them being passive random procs that the player has very little control over, worries me a little bit in that aspect. That's about it for what I have to say about the current beta iteration of Shadow. Overall, this is still substantially better than the first iteration we had on Alpha, and it has potential to become something great. I would love to hear your opinions on how Shadow is looking so far for Dragonflight in the comments below, and as always, if you ever have questions or just want to talk about the spec, I'm live almost every day around 8 Eastern at twitch.tv/NeptusSP.